are allowed to think big and dream big. How to generate different systems. Systems that provide stability and are nested within the harmony of nature. I'm excited to explore with you the intriguing bandwidth of information our researchers and friends have surfaced. Let's dive into our next topic to find out how we can actively shape a future worth pursuing and living for.
Welcome everybody, my name is Armin and today we will make a short dive into the dialectic of Hegel. We live in a time where there are many threats and fears hanging over us like the sword of Damocles. There is war in the Ukraine, and the action against global warming are carried out reluctantly or insufficiently by most of the powerful states of the world, which are so desperately needed for the necessary change. In the face of these global threats, it is easy to lose your optimism or even your hope. But how to cope with these seemingly overwhelming obstacles? In my philosophy study, I got an introduction to a very interesting concept which maybe can help with that. It doesn't ignore the problems of our time, but sets them into perspective both on a time frame as well as on a moral perspective. It's known under the unimpressive term of the Dialectic of Hegel. But in my opinion, it deserves way more attention. Because it shows us that human, positive, progress is happening, but never just linear, but more so in 3 steps. To follow this thought, we can only look back in history. There we often see that the human world always leans in one extreme, then, compensating for the previous one, kicking to the other side. This is called, basically, dialectic. In the end, it finds a conclusion out of those 2 extreme ideas. Or, in philosophical terms, there is first a thesis, followed by an antithesis, which merges into a synthesis. After Hegel, both of these extreme tendencies contain parts of the truth, and just with their interactions, or even clashing, they can exchange those parts and find a resolution in a better way, the synthesis. This way, the kind of progress is never lost. It's just a pendulum swinging from one side to the other. The process can repeat itself until the best synthesis is found, or new aspects, and therefore parts of the truth, arise and have to be woven into the net of conclusion. Or in other words, the true nature will emerge through the wisdom of time. But let us enlighten this with some examples. At the beginning of the 18th century, the absolute monarchy found its peak with Louis XIV, also called the Sun King. He held all the state power in his region, making him the ultimate monarch. This shall be our thesis. This rather extreme variant was followed by the French Revolution starting in 1789, which wanted to give the power to the people, making everybody equal. But the result was not just representative government, but more so anarchy, chaos, and the terror regime of the Jacobins, beheading thousands of so-called enemies of the revolution. This shall be our antithesis. With the rise of Napoleon, the revolution ended with him as an emperor, holding most of the power of the state, but also bringing important citizen rights with a code civil and certain liberties. This process went on towards our modern balanced constitutional governmental system, which represents a majority by vote, but also protecting basic civil rights as well as rights of minorities. But let us dive into that a little more with some philosophical facts. Georg Friedrich Hegel was born in Stuttgart in 1770 and became late in his life the head of the University of Berlin, where he wrote the Philosophy of History in 1830. It is a big and horribly confusing written book which I failed to read, but luckily some others did it for me, on which I built my understanding of it. Hegel was the main head of the German idealism, which arose from Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. This states that there are limits of reason. No matter what, we can't grasp the true nature or substance of objects around us in its wholeness. This originates from the founder of the rationalism, Descartes, who questioned everything, even his own existence. He solved this with his famous quote, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. So in those traditions, we ourselves should take everything into scrutiny of our rational mind while being aware of its limits. Those limits are, for example, our perception and the categories we speak and think in. They are not sufficient and will always be a filter to us. The easiest way for me to understand that is through color. The perception of colors is just the receptors in our eyes that respond to the specific information in light photons. But to put it into perspective, we humans have 3 color cones. Mantis shrimp has one of the most sophisticated eyes in the animal world with 12 color cones. So, we cannot even imagine what they possibly can see. So let us retain. There's always just subjective and never objective knowledge, and with reason we can find our own blind spots, but not necessarily fill them. Hegel also wrote a lot about dualism between spirit and body, or subject and object, and those are all part of an underlying substance, but they cannot exist for themselves as subjects, but they can create themselves initially in the contrast to another subject or even their opposite, which Hegel calls self-othering. Yeah, this becomes quite complex, and to be honest, I haven't quite grasped it myself, even with my notes from philosophy study and the research I've done for this podcast. But there are some major ideas that will come up, and I think they are important to develop further. So if we don't fully think in Hegel's way, as long as we come up with good and meaningful ideas, I think he wouldn't complain. As we saw by now, one of the main ideas is everything is subjective. We can't grasp an objective state of being. I think this is a very good beginning of any scientific work or thought experiment. It reminds us of being humble in our reasoning without rushing towards conclusions, nor being too firm and unchanging in our beliefs. Or, as my refrigerator magnet puts it wisely, don't believe everything you think. So even it strongly builds on Socrates' "I know that I know nothing," it is not an excuse to relativize everything we try to learn, but to intensify our struggle to come as closely as possible to an objective truth, even though it is impossible in the end. So, actually, how do we do that? For this, I isolated 3 main points. First, look into the history. Even though we can be proud of the progress we made, the past was far from being primitive. History is a kind of repository of wisdom, and every area had its own important understandings. The ancient Greece, for example, had a concept of community that we lost today. The Roman Empire, and partially the medieval times, teach us lessons in the importance of honor and personal sacrifice. And the 2 world wars reminded us of the importance of individualism and the need for resistance even against the supposed big and loud majority. So we see we can rescue a lot of knowledge from the past, which is so important for the blind spots of today. Second, learn from ideas you dislike. So we shall also learn from enemies or alien beliefs. To start with a quote from Hegel: "What silver of sense and reason might contained in otherwise frightening or foreign phenomena." For example, and this will be a strong example or controversial one, what can we learn from nationalism? I know we all know nationalism is bad and led to horrible things, but there was a reason behind it. There was a reason why it existed. We can learn the need of people for feeling proud, for example, where they come from, the need to identify with something beyond their own achievements, the need for belonging, and the search for meaning beyond their own ego, which in itself doesn't sound so horrible. And third, progress is messy. Let's add to the series of dialectic I already outlined before. There are a lot of contradicting ideas in the world, and they all contain some wisdom or some necessity. For example, it is a difficult trade-off between privacy and security, between individualism and social compromise, between pleasure and necessity. I couldn't work on this without thinking about the yin and yang, or the tantric male and female parts, and all things that make the subject in the end complete, and I think in this way it can be thought too. So, coming to the conclusion. Bad situations can be seen as an overreaction of a certain idea. If you agree with this idea or not doesn't really matter, because it is an essential part of the progress of human development, and therefore neither really bad nor good. There are no dark moments, but just necessary changes or challenges that will eventually find their synthesis in the merge of its counterparts, or other seemingly contradicting ideas. Thus, the global rise of the political right can be seen as a countermove to the rise of more and more liberal and humane political parties. In this regard, it shouldn't surprise us that after Barack Obama came the Donald. The war in the Ukraine is an unprecedented exception to the longest peacetime we had in Europe since the beginning of written history. And the insufficient actions against global warming shouldn't overshadow the international progress that has been made over centuries of political work and dragging compromise. All this clash is needed. It is allowed to be painful and exhausting, it is allowed to be slow, but it is a way humanity developed since it exists. I hope with this little episode you are able to see the comfort in it as I do. I hope we can together work towards the best of all conclusions for humanity and the whole world in all its complexity.